Okay. All right. We're live. This is WhaleFest Monterey. Welcome everybody. My name is Dan Hafley. I am your MC for today. We have a wonderful program for you. I serve as Secretary of the Board of Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, which is a sponsor of today's event, which is part of the reason that I am here. I'm very excited by the lineup of speakers that we have today. We have a lot about scientific and environmental activities and initiatives that are occurring in Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary. I want to start with one of the environmental initiatives that comes from a very innovative company on the business side. With that, we will have a presentation by Renata Massion of CRUZ Foam. And the name of the presentation is From Cradle to Reuse, Leveraging Life Cycle Thinking and Life Cycle Assessment in Sustainable Packaging Innovation. Renata is an environmental enthusiast, and she is the Senior Sustainability Manager at CRUZ Foam. I'm from Santa Cruz. CRUZ Foam is very well known on our side of the bay for their very innovative work. Renata supports the development of cutting-edge packaging foam that embodies a new frontier in sustainable materials. She spearheads CRUZ Foam's initiatives in responsible sourcing, life cycle assessment, and environmentally conscious disposal strategies. She has a bachelor's degree in environmental science and management, and she combines her deep understanding of global dynamics with technical expertise to drive positive environmental change and empower a universal drive for sustainable progress. Welcome, Renata. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for being here. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about CRUZ Foam, what it is, and how we use life cycle thinking and then life cycle assessment to quantify that thinking. Next slide. So I've split it into 4 parts. I'm going to take this off. Split it into 4 parts. Part 1, we're going to talk about the plastic problem. How did we even get here? Part 2, what is CRUZ Foam? What are we doing? Part 3 is where we get into the nitty-gritty of life cycle thinking and design and how we use that at CRUZ Foam. And then part 4, conclusion, and then we'll have time for questions. Next slide. So part 1, the plastic problem. How did we get here? Next slide. Where does all of our plastic go? So we know from the last EPA study, in 2018, the US produced 35.7 million tons of plastic, and that's just in the United States. That is a lot of plastic. We also know from that study that only 8.7% of that plastic was recycled. So where is the rest of it going? We know it's not going to the recycling. We know most of that plastic then ends up in landfill, where it takes hundreds of years to biodegrade. And then even when it biodegrades, it's mostly turning into smaller and smaller bits of plastics, which then end up as microplastics and end up in our environment in harmful ways, which we will talk about. The rest, which is a smaller portion, is what we call mismanaged. And a portion of that is then ending up in the hydrosphere, which is our oceans. Next slide. So this little graphic shows us what happens to the plastic physically, chemically, and biologically when it ends up in the ocean. So starting with physically, we have macroplastics like bags, things like that, things that you'll see floating on top of the ocean. Then these UV lights come down, they break that plastic down into smaller and smaller pieces, and most of that is then sinking to the bottom. Chemically, we then have kind of 2 separate things happen. The plastics are absorbing and concentrating chemicals that are dissolved in seawater, and additionally, the chemical additives in that plastic is being leached from the plastic and causing problems with ocean equilibrium. Then finally, biologically, it will bioaccumulate, so the fish and creatures on the bottom of the ocean, where all of that plastic has floated down, are eating that plastic. The things that eat those creatures are then eating the plastic again, and it bioaccumulates up to the top of the food chain. And that's where we see these studies that say we find plastic in whales, we're finding plastic in our bloodstreams, in our lungs, in human placentas. And we also have seen, I'm sure a lot of you have seen, there is a stat out there that says that we as humans eat 1 credit card's worth of plastic every week. So that is a lot of plastic that is ever present in our environment and our atmosphere that is going into our bodies and causing different harmful effects. Next slide. Now, part 2, what even is CRUZ foam and what are we doing? Next slide. CRUZ foam origins. So we were founded in 2017. And it was originally an offshoot of the UCSC Rolandi lab. So John Feltz, who's our current CTO, and Marco Rolandi, our CTO, they were working with a novel material called chitin. They were also very, very avid surfers. So they're in the ocean, they're looking around, they're seeing plastic in the waves. They're then looking down at their surfboards and they're saying, okay, this is also made of expanded polystyrene, which is a form of plastic. And they're saying, okay, how can we preserve the ocean around us and stop this kind of backward system? So back to the chitin. Chitin is the second most abundant biopolymer on Earth next to cellulose. And what's important about chitin is that it has a really high strength to weight ratio. So we see it in things like shrimp shells where something needs to be really protected. So they said, okay, we're working with this material. It's really interesting. We have this strength to weight ratio that we need in different packaging foams. Can we make a compostable and earth-friendly foam that we can maybe make surfboards out of? So they started with the surfboards, and they started trying to make surfboards, and then they soon realized that this foam innovation could not only transform the surfing industry, but the plastic industry as a whole. Next slide. So now, after many years of research and development and many, many formula trials, our roots are still in the ocean, and we've expanded our vision to replace all single-use plastic with an earth-friendly alternative. So now we have an earth-friendly and compostable foam that is made from a proprietary blend of upcycled food waste. And upcycled, just for reference, is anything that was bound for landfill and then is diverted from landfill. So maybe you have an old t-shirt and you make a tote bag out of it. That's an upcycled tote bag. It can mean a range of things. And additionally, something that was very important to us when we started out is we didn't want companies that are working with us to have to buy a ton of capital equipment specifically made for our foam, things like that. So our technology is drop-in, and we can enable existing manufacturers with their existing equipment to make CRUZ foam. Next slide. How is CRUZ foam made? We've a very broad overview. Second. So we start with our raw materials. They're purified, mixed, and then pelletized, and they turn into those tiny pellets on the left. Those pellets are then heated, extruded, and expanded, so they go through a very small die, and then from that die, the foam expands, and that's what it looks like in the third picture over there. We can sell it in both plank and sheet profiles, and then if you look at the last photo, number 4, we can also convert it into what we say are limitless applications. So you can see a piece of technology there. We've had some shaped CRUZ foam that is hitting all of those points that would be vulnerable during transportation. So if it's dropped during transportation or something like that, then that piece of technology would be protected by our CRUZ foam, and it would not hopefully end up in landfill where it doesn't break down at the end. Next slide. Just a quick product sampling so you know what I'm talking about when I do the rest of my presentation. On the left here, we have our CRUZ Cool. That is a cooler, and that is mostly made for anything that needs to be refrigerated during transport. That can be things like meal kits or even pharmaceuticals, seafood, things like that. In the middle, we have our CRUZ Cush, which is for technology and other things that need to be protected during transport from breakage. We also have our EcoVino, which is a new product that we have created with another company called Bay Cities. We have a really great partnership with them. That one, you can't actually see the CRUZ foam here. It's combined with a paperboard corrugate to protect wine bottles in transit. So the CRUZ foam is inside of that, providing that extra protection. Next slide. Okay, part 3, life cycle thinking. Next slide. So what even is life cycle thinking? What am I talking about? At its very core, it is a holistic way to minimize waste. So what we're looking at here is when we're creating a product, we want to look at every portion of the life cycle, and we always want to be thinking about every other portion of the life cycle when we're looking at one portion. So we start with resources. Where are we getting our resources? What are we even sourcing? And have we thought about that in the larger context? Manufacturing, how can we minimize manufacturing waste? How can we minimize the water we're using, the energy we're using? And then we get to use and reuse, which is this third over here. And are we designing for something to be reused? How can we minimize the electricity that something uses during its use? Then finally, we have disposal, which, as you can see here, I have it in a circle. So what we think is we say we're designing with the end in mind, and end is always in quotations, because when we think of something, we don't want to think of it linearly, where there's this disposal, it goes straight to landfill, it sits there for 500 years. We want everything that has waste, and we want that waste to be a resource for something else. We want everything to have a second and third and fourth useful life. Okay, so sourcing, what I'll do is I will go through each one of these 4 steps. I'll talk about what we think and kind of an overview of that step, and then I'll talk about how we use it at CRUZ Foam. You'll see that no life cycle step exists in a vacuum, so I'll be talking about all of them a lot. So when we think of sourcing, this is kind of the background work that we do, but it is so important. We're really thinking about taking ownership of the entire supply chain and how can we minimize waste even before our resources get to maybe our manufacturing or our home or where we are in complete control of those resources. So we're going to talk about Scope 3 emissions. They are a very large part of carbon accounting. Just for background, when we talk about corporate emissions, we split them into 3 scopes. The first scope is emissions that are in direct control of a corporation. So that's if you're at a factory, those are the emissions that are coming directly from creating that product at that factory. Scope 2 emissions are purchased electricity, purchased steam, things like that. And then Scope 3 emissions are everything else. That is everything that is sourced before it ends up at a corporation, and then everything that happens after the product leaves that corporation. So, not surprisingly, Scope 3 emissions can account for up to 90% of company emissions, and that includes everything that is sourced before it ends up at a factory or a manufacturing plant. So the guidelines here that we want to adhere to is the first thing we want to do is we want to assess our supply chain. What do we know about our supply chain? Where are there unknowns, and where are there risk factors in our supply chain? So for example, sourcing fish can be a little bit of a risky supply chain factor. A lot of that fishing is happening in the ocean. It can be really tricky to have a good view of how that fish is being sourced from the ocean, so that can be a little bit of a risk factor. During this step, we really want to think about what are we expecting from our suppliers. So do we want, if we're sourcing fish again, do we want to have some sort of sustainability or like some sort of certification that we have all of our suppliers adhere to? What are we looking for? And then the second thing is trace. We want to be able to trace everything from origin to when it ends up at our factory manufacturing plant, our company. So one way to do this is to do what we call like a spot project, and that is we take one shipment to our factory, we look at it, we look at the lot number, and then we make sure that we can trace through paperwork every single step and every single step of the way that shipment came from when it was grown or when it was sourced to when it gets to our plant. Then the last thing, this is where it becomes more fun, is we look at minimize. So then we can really assess and interpret our supply chain and say, okay, can we get this thing that we're sourcing internationally? Can we get it domestically? Can we minimize our emissions from transportation? Can we get something that is upcycled? Can we look at the environmental impact of every single thing in our supply chain and minimize that somehow through replacement, through minimizing our emissions from transportation, things like that. Next slide. So sourcing at CRUZ Foam, this is a really large part of our sustainability initiatives because we know from quantifying the impact of our foam that it does cause most of our emissions are from the sourcing that happens even before our ingredients get to our plant. So we have on the right here our sourcing pillars. They're transparency, localization, environmental impact, ethical labor practices, and continuous improvement. So transparency is where we talk kind of about that trace and assess that I talked about on the side previously. We want to have a really good understanding of our entire supply chain. So we want to act as if our scope 3 emissions are our scope 1 and 2 emissions that we have direct control over. So we want to have that level of transparency and take full control over that supply chain. The way that we do this at CRUZ Foam is we have really robust relationships with all of our suppliers. So we are in pretty constant contact with them. When we onboard a supplier, when we start to buy things from them, we have them sign our supplier code of conduct, which goes through a lot of things, anything from having energy reduction targets to making sure a supplier is providing parental leave. It is a lot of different things. Additionally, once a year, we have our suppliers go through a supplier code of conduct questionnaire where they'll answer specific questions to ensure that they are adhering to our code of conduct. And we're really happy that we have 100% supplier compliance, and our suppliers have been really, really helpful with this project because it is a task and it can definitely be a little bit boring for them. So we do appreciate that. The second thing is localization. Where can we get our ingredients? Can we get them more local than internationally? Can we source them domestically? How can we support our local economies through our sourcing? Third is environmental impact. This one is a little bit self-explanatory. We're always looking at the environmental impact of our ingredients and everything that we source, and we're always trying to minimize that impact. Ethical labor practices, also a little bit self-explanatory. We really want to confirm that every person within our supply chain, even if they're not directly on our payroll, is being treated with dignity and respect. Number 5 is continuous improvement. So we know that we are continuously and continually looking at our supply chain. We're learning more about sustainable supply chains. And when we learn new things, we want to be able to look at our supply chain and be able to directly adhere to those things that we're learning. So for example, when I started, we didn't really know that we could get 70% of our ingredients upcycled. Now we do, and we're able to source those ingredients, which is giving ingredients, once again, that were destined for landfill. We're diverting those from landfill and giving them a second and third life. So being able to divert from landfill, put these things into our foam, and then our foam will hopefully go to compost, giving it another life as a nutrient-rich soil. Next slide. So our second portion is product manufacturing, and this is where we get into life cycle assessment. So when we're thinking about manufacturing a product, we are, again, always thinking about everything from sourcing to disposal or through disposal. Life cycle assessment is basically how we quantify life cycle thinking. It is a holistic method of understanding the environmental impact of a product at each stage of its life. So it comes in kind of 4-ish steps. We start with goal and scope. Why are we doing this life cycle assessment? What are we trying to find out? And that's where we will look at, okay, do we want to quantify what's happening from sourcing to manufacturing, or do we want to quantify what's happening from sourcing through disposal? That's what we would call a cradle to grave life cycle assessment. This is also where we look at our functional unit. So what function are we trying to quantify? Are we trying to quantify how much foam we would need to protect 1,000 pounds of salmon transporting from Alaska to California, something like that. So there has to be some sort of real life function for a life cycle assessment. We then go to life cycle inventory. That is where we actually create our model. There are a bunch of different great softwares out there that can help with life cycle assessment. And that is where we input everything that we're using, our whole formula, the energy we use in manufacturing, the transportation distance, everything you can think of under the sun that is involved in that life cycle. Number 3 is impact assessment. That is where we get to calculate, and then we can see, okay, what is the actual impact of our foam and where specifically are those impacts coming from? So what we look at is the thing that people are most familiar with is carbon footprint. So that would be your global warming potential. That is a really great impact indicator to look at. There are also a bunch of other impact indicators. So eutrophication, acidification, water use, fossil fuel use. So you can look at a product through a bunch of different lenses and really understand the holistic environmental impact. And then step 4, which should be happening throughout the entire process, so that should be happening at steps 1 through 3, not just after 3, is interpretation. And that's where we look at things where we say, okay, for example, EPS, expanded polystyrene, which is that foam that we can get in a lot of packaging, that's probably gonna have a really low eutrophication potential because it's actually going to landfill and not breaking down. So it's not gonna have a ton of eutrophication potential, whereas a banana peel or an orange peel might have a higher eutrophication potential because it is actually breaking down into the environment, and it can cause certain issues. However, does that mean that an orange peel is worse than petroleum-based foam? Probably not. If we looked at fossil fuel use, the petroleum-based foam would be very, very high, and there would be no petroleum used in an orange peel or a banana peel. So that's where we want to see, okay, what impact are we actually looking at, and what do we care about, and how can we look at that holistically? And through that, we can understand, okay, if we're looking at a foam, is it coming from sourcing? Is there a ton of transportation emissions? Probably not, because foams are very light, so they're gonna have a very low transportation emissions, and it's gonna be mostly from, if we're looking at a petroleum-based foam, it's gonna be mostly from where we get that petroleum is gonna be a really high emissions factor. Next slide. So this is how we've done it at CRUZ Foam. In 2023, we completed a third-party peer-reviewed life cycle assessment of our foam. We are also going through another LCA currently on another iteration of our foam, and that will be available in the next couple months. And this allowed us to really understand the granular impact of our foam at each life cycle stage, and then further minimize its impact. So like I talked about before, it's not surprising that most of our emissions come from before our ingredients even get to our manufacturing plant. So they come from our formula and our sourcing, which is why we put such a strong emphasis on our sourcing program. So this little graphic shows our system boundary that we used. So we start on the left here, our formula goes in, We look at manufacturing, transport, distribution, use, and then our disposal or our end of life. We use 3 different disposal scenarios. So one was 100% of the foam is going to compost. One was 50% of the foam is going to compost, 50% going to landfill, and one was 100% of the foam going to landfill. So we wanted to look at the end of life that our foam was intended to go to, so that's compost, and then kind of what we would call the worst case scenario. We don't want our foam to go sit in landfill. So that is what we're trying to minimize, but we also want to see it is possible that our foam will go to landfill. So we want to have a really good understanding and be able to quantify the impact that it will have in that disposal scenario. Next slide. So use and reuse. How can we turn use into reuse? So when we look at this, I have this linear kind of life cycle laid out here. We have sourcing, manufacturing, use, and disposal. So if we think about something going to landfill, it's very linear. It'll sit in that landfill until it eventually will break down after years and years. What we want to do is in this use cycle, we want to have that arrow going up as many times as possible and reuse and reuse and reuse as many times as we can. Then, once we finally get to the end of its useful life, we want to use that disposal to turn it into resources for something else. But back to use and reuse, we also want to make sure when we look at each use case, is the thing that we are trying to replace, is our product an actually good candidate for reuse? So if we're thinking about something like a plastic water bottle, if we're trying to replace that, and we have maybe a glass bottle, we want to quantify through probably life cycle assessment, which I talked about before. We want to quantify the impacts of that glass bottle and see, okay, how many times would we have to reuse that glass bottle before it offsets the emissions that were needed to create that glass bottle? So there are a couple things we know about glass bottles. We know they're pretty heavy, especially compared to a plastic bottle, and we know that they're very breakable. So we have to be able to compare, is a glass bottle actually a good reuse case compared to a single-use plastic bottle? Realistically, there are a fair amount of emissions associated with the creation of glass bottles and the transportation of glass bottles because they're very heavy. And then we also know that we are clumsy. We're probably going to break that glass bottle before we can use it enough times to offset those emissions. So maybe the glass bottle isn't necessarily the best alternative to that single-use plastic bottle. But there are a ton of other reuse options for bottles that are probably an awesome reuse case study. So we have metal bottles, things that you can put stickers on, things that you can use over and over and over again. And those are an awesome case study for not having to use that plastic bottle. So if we have our metal bottle, we use it for years, we're filling it up 2-3 times a day. If we're hitting our hydration goals, that is definitely going to offset the plastic bottle. And we also have the infrastructure to support the use of that. And it's very socially acceptable to come in with your water bottle and your reusable water bottle. I think probably in this community, it's less socially acceptable to come in with a plastic bottle. And we also have water fountains that are accessible by the public. So we can then, I don't have to fill up my water bottle at home and then buy a plastic bottle when I want to refill it. I can then just go to a public water fountain, refill it. I haven't bought a plastic water bottle in years because we have a really great use case for reuse. Next slide. So, use and reuse at CRUZ Foam. In the beginning, we have really designed this foam to be composted. So use and reuse is kind of a way for us to inject innovation into our product. So looking at the CRUZ Cool, for example, That is designed as a cooler to be shipped. So it can ship seafood, it can ship meal kits, things like that. And meal kits are a really great example of when we can have a reuse system. So when someone gets a CRUZ Cool, they can obviously reuse it as a cooler again, and we encourage people to do that. It's not going to break down immediately upon impact in your home. It can definitely be reused at least a couple times. Then what we like to see and what we're working on with a lot of different projects is looking at reuse in a way of, okay, you receive your meal kit, you are getting that meal kit maybe once a week, once every 2 weeks. That means that the delivery person is coming to your house over and over again. So how can we get the CRUZ Cool so instead of having to throw it in your compost or throw it away, you could then put that CRUZ Cool on your doorstep. It would get picked up, sanitized, and used again. And then that further decreases the emissions from our product by being able to reuse it. And we know it's a super light product, so the transportation emissions are not very high there. So that is one reuse case at CRUZ Foam. We're also looking at some innovative ways to use our material in other materials. Additionally, we can grind up the foam and create more foam with it. So that is more of a recycle and reuse case. So that is where we're trying to inject innovation, and we're always looking at new and interesting ideas for our CRUZ Cool, CRUZ Foam. How can we reuse it? How can we get another life before it even goes to compost and becomes nutrient-rich soil? Next slide. Okay, disposal, this is our final one. Disposal is kind of our final chance to ensure that a product has had a useful life and a second life and a third life and a fourth life and beyond. So let's use food waste as an example. We know that food waste makes up 24% of municipal solid waste in the US. So that is a combination of food waste that has gone to landfill and could have gone to compost, and food that could have been eaten but ended up in landfill because it was not pretty enough to make it to the grocery store for whatever reason. It was thrown away. It was extra at a restaurant and they couldn't use it. So that is just wasted food that is sitting in the landfill and creating methane emissions and could be used for another purpose. So the most important thing within disposal is proper sortation. We need to have the ability to sort out, for example, food waste, to sort out properly recyclable items, paper and plastic, and when we have things sorted properly, then we can get them to their proper disposal. Additionally, we need increased infrastructure for composting. So composters do need to be able to take all of the material that's coming their way, and they need to be able to make a profit and run their operations efficiently. So increased infrastructure for composting is going to be very important, especially because there are a lot of innovative new ideas, especially in the packaging space that we see, that are going to compost. And that also goes back to proper sortation. Things need to be labeled correctly, and they need to be able to actually make it to the composter before they get sorted out into landfill. So one thing we're looking at here is how do we label our foam to make sure it doesn't get confused with EPS and then just go straight to landfill. And then we have to minimize our landfill. Again, our landfill was not made as a long-term solution. It was a place to store waste, and then it has become this long-term solution, and it's not a fit. And then finally, being innovative with our uses for waste. So how can we upcycle something? How can we turn it into another innovative material? How can we avoid that landfill and really create that circular life cycle for a product using both life cycle thinking and life cycle assessment to quantify that? Next slide. Disposal at CRUZ Foam. So we are LOMI approved. The LOMI is a It's a counter appliance. You can put your food waste, your CRUZ foam, other Lomi approved products in there. You press a button. It uses kind of heat and disintegration to create a dirt out of that, and then you can throw it into your backyard or wherever. And we really strive at CRUZ Foam to have a suite of different disposal options. We are also industrially and backyard compostable, so we have done our industrial composting testing, which is the ASTM D6400 and D6868, and we have another composting certification in process. We've also had really strong results in our home composting. So on the right there, you can see these are the results of my home compost. I absolutely do not take perfect care of it, so the fact that we were able to have complete disintegration by day 90 is really exciting for our foam. And then we're also, like I just talked about, we also are really recognizing reuse as what we'd like to be the default before it even goes to compost. Next slide. All right, thank you so much. I will open it up for questions now.
Can you get that Lomi certified appliance that does the composting for you that you can just, does it really take 90 days or?
So for the Lomi, that actually, I think there's a couple different cycles that you can use for the Lomi. I think the standard Lomi cycle takes 8 hours. Don't quote me on it. You should be able to find it at lomi.com. It's LOMI. I think I haven't used mine for very long. I think it's a really great option, especially if you don't have backyard composting, because it's a pretty small appliance and it really breaks down food waste into a kind of minimal amount of product that you actually have to deal with. And it's really, really fast. You can kind of put it on overnight and then you have dirt in the morning. That is a good question. I think it's somewhere north of $200, but I'm not sure how much. 400. Any other questions? Yes.
Great talk, thank you very much. So CRUZ Foam seems like an exemplary company. But
Thank you.
Partly because the founders, for whatever personal integrity reasons, chose to pursue this path. Are there other companies that you're aware of that are great examples? Are there government mandates? Is there any push to make this more of a, I'm not gonna say required process, but more of a suggested process than just hoping people do the right thing?
Yeah, that's my father, everyone. Shout out to my parents for raising me. I did not plant that question in the audience, but such a good question. So I think there's probably two parts to your question. There are a bunch of different innovative companies that we're really excited about. The one that comes to mind right now is Sway the Future. They make a flexible kind of packaging that is a plastic replacement, and they make it out of algae. It's 100% bio-based. They have amazing marketing. Their website's really exciting to look at. Their Instagram's really exciting to look at. It would be Sway the Future. They are doing really awesome stuff. There is also some mycelium, so mushroom foams, which are really cool. I'm trying to think of other ones. But yes, there are really innovative projects happening, and we're seeing really strong momentum in the market for very large companies actually coming to us kind of small, innovative packaging companies and saying, hey, we're ready to get rid of our plastic. We're ready for this new innovation. Secondly, there is some legislation happening. So there are kind of 2 or 3 really prominent bills and laws that are being implemented right now. SB 54 in California is the first one, and I could do probably an hour talk on that one. That is a landmark bill in California. It basically says that by 2032, 100% of packaging in California has to be compostable or recyclable. And so that is an extended producer responsibility law, and that is going to be incredibly complicated to implement, but they have a really great advisory board that is working on it. If you're interested, and you can go to SB 54, Cal Recycle is implementing that. You can go to the public talks on it. There's lots of webinars because it's going to be implemented and affecting a lot of different people, a lot of different companies. There are also, I'm forgetting, maybe SB 343, I'm forgetting the actual number, but eventually all California municipal waste should be sorted into organics and non-organics, and so all of that food waste should be going actually to composters. And municipalities have the ability to either give each resident and company a composting bucket so they can put their food waste in, or they can set up a sortation system so that people put everything into their trash and then the municipality will sort it out. So there are really exciting things happening in legislation, and we are hoping that people will take action and support those, but there are also some government things happening, so both sides are really working together. I think that's all we have time for.
Great job, Renata. And imagine if every company did this. Actually, don't go away. Imagine if every company did this and every company had a Renata. We'd be in great shape. So thank you so much. And as a token of our appreciation from WhaleFest, we'd like to give you a little gift and thank you for all you do. Thank you.